Well, I certainly want to thank everybody for coming out today and joining us in the presentation regarding our continuance of LiDAR. Our first presentation was very well attended. We had about 172 folks registered, and they came from all over. We had folks from Killarney, the PAW. We had councils that had come together to sit in one room in order to take it. So we're very pleased with that. And today's session is a continuance of that. So LiDAR, climate adaptation, and the need of climate adaptation planning. In today's presentation, will speak to all parts of that. The first session that we're on talking about today will be representative of the North region. But first of all, we want to take you through a little bit of the past, and we want you to understand what climate is all about, climate adaptation. Little housekeeping, I ask you to keep your mics off, and also ask you to hold questions until the end of the session. We will be posting and reading questions off the chat box. Once the presentation is over and we've gone through the questions, we will stay online, and Hank will hang around, and we could do a little one-on-one chat if time permits. So with that, we'll kind of get things going. So I want to really talk about where did this all start? And I think for the River Basin, it started after the 1997 flood. We had our US and Canadian offices, Manitoba offices, starting to collect LiDAR data. And in 2006, on the US side, they were very fortunate to be able to have their data collection completed. And I think on the US side, LiDAR has really offered them a great opportunity to plan far, far better than they ever thought they were. They're able to, look at their projects and place them in priority and work on major projects such as the Fargo diversion that's going on presently, even today. And it is because of this planning that the preparation of not only the US side, but the Manitoba side is going to be able to create individual climate adaptation plans, which eventually we hope that some of the efforts that come out of those plans could be attached to your emergency response plans. And when you give consideration to some of the things that are going on, you're able to address that. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happened in the news lately. And I think from some of the slides you're about to see is that you may recall some of this. So this year, July 20, 2021, the big fires that were occurring, we were in a really hot cycle, and the drought was, and the extreme heat was seeing outcomes which were quite severe. And for many communities to the south of our areas and to the north, they were looking at evacuations, and they were dealing with situations where their towns or communities were in danger. So, there were about 23 new wildfires reported in Manitoba over that period of time. And this is just another picture that came from our Winnipeg News CTV. And as we went forward, we started to really understand that, wow, we're in a really heavy duty drought period. And how are we going to address these issues? And what does that mean for communities? And some of you will recall, like as we looked into the south, that areas such as within the Pembina corridor really create a lot of issues. And as they were getting water supplies, they had to go into water rationing. And even this article right here, you can see, again from CVT News, that, the crops took some punishment from that. The yields within the wheat crops and some of the others were not up to what they were usually used to. And this has created problems. And this is all part of what we call, whether you want to say climate change, but no matter what, this is all part of seeing this drought cycle. And it's important for ourselves as communities, our First Nations communities, in order to be able to be better prepared in order to be able to deal with drought. I want to talk about other events. So, as this climate is changing, it's speculated that we may see more tornadoes, that some of the southern regions, the climates or the weather patterns that they're seeing could head north. And this is a picture of the area of St. Clements in 2006 at Gull Lake. And I wanted to bring this one up because I lived this moment when I was the mayor of St. Clements. And this was really devastating, and we had no plan. As a matter of fact, some of the problems that we had to deal through this could have been easily corrected if we kind of knew how to deal with it, and were better prepared for it. And not to say that this was climate change, but I want to say that this is a possibility of what climate change may be bringing into our region of the basin in the near future. So again, what have we seen in the news in the last week? Well, here's an article that has come up with the flooding that we've seen in BC. You know, this will be the most expensive disaster in BC history. And you've seen it on the news and the washouts and major infrastructure being taken out, which is now creating delays in transportation. Who would ever thought that, you know, this sort of occurrence would be happening? But again, this becoming the new norm? And I think as we hear the presentation from Hank, we're going to start to think that, you know, maybe it is, and maybe we need to be better prepared. So this is also a part that was in Nova Scotia, and they too were dealing with major rainfall events. And you can see some of the washout to the infrastructure. And again, how does this affect the communities? Are we prepared for it? What are our climate adaptation plans? Are we addressing these plans, or are we bringing these plans and making them part of emergency response plans, which we as municipalities are all supposed to have? And I don't think you can be prepared for everything, but I think you can certainly step back and take a look at what the possibility of what climate change will bring us, and how do we get better at getting ready for that. So everybody, we certainly want to introduce Hank and Strategic. Hank has been working alongside the basin in partnership and under contract in order to help us move forward with the LiDAR and the climate adaptation planning that we're hoping to see today. The plan itself is very high level. So basically, it does not detail down to individual communities, but what it will talk about is the fact that the reality of climate change, the need to address these situations, and how we can go about doing so. So Hank, you ready to go? I love that Blue Bomber hat, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. You know, it's not that many times in my life when I've been the morning after a Grey Cup victory. So probably the best bomber team, certainly in my lifetime, deserves a little recognition. So I'm ready to go. Steve and Rebecca, thank you so much for the opportunity to support the work here. So I'm just going to get right into it. What is climate adaptation? What are the key, this is what we're going to talk about, the key impacts of climate change. Changes in temperature and precipitation is a fact. Changes in the relative frequency of floods and droughts. Changes in Red River Basin flow patterns, and I'll give you a sneak preview of some work we've done in our shop that speaks to this point. Adaptation priorities. I'm going to talk about natural infrastructure because of its importance as an adaptation technology, and I'll explain why. And then, of course, how LiDAR can assist with this agenda, with our adaptation agenda. And we're actually going to talk about this is a typo. We're going to talk about the North Red River Basin in this presentation. What is climate adaptation? It's mitigating climate risk. That's adapting to the impacts of climate change. We're not talking in this presentation about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's an important but a different issue. It's a different presentation. Another terminology, similar terminology, is building resilience to climate change. It's essentially the same thing as adaptation. So what are our key climate impacts? Well, I just, you know, we have our own analysis. We have the analysis of the Prairie Climate Center, which I will mention briefly, but I thought I'd better go back and see what the federal government in their very recent report on the Prairie provinces had to say on this. And the words are quite interesting. I'm going to blow it up a little bit. The prairies in Western Canada have generally had the strong, I've just got something blocking my screen here. Yeah, here we go. Have had the strongest warming to date across southern Canada, especially in winter. Further warming is projected, resulting in longer growing seasons, earlier spring peak stream flow, increasingly severe heat waves, and increased wildfire risk. More frequent and intense droughts are anticipated across the southern prairies in summer. While more precipitation is expected generally, summer rainfall may change little. More intense rainfalls are also projected. We're going to talk about this point several times, that although precipitation is not expected to change that much on an annual basis, we will see less water. The hydrologic budgets will be reduced. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. This is a really interesting point also in this federal document, and it talks all about collaboration. Collaboration is needed among all levels of government, with stakeholders such as watershed stewardship groups, rural municipalities, and conservation districts. So it's all about collaboration because no one can do it alone. Water is difficult to manage in a silo. You need an integrated approach. So that's a bit of the federal backstory there, what guidance the federal government has given us. It's all premised on this idea that the science is correct. Should we believe the global climate models? And I would argue yes, because since the first time they've been since the very first models were available in the early 70s, they've been correct. They get better and better every year as computing power and more physical reality is represented in these models, but they've basically been correct. They've correctly forecasted future temperatures since they were since the very crudest models were available 50 years ago. And this is just an interesting representation. I want to give a nod to the Prairie Climate Center, with whom I worked about 5 years ago now. It got me very interested in the subject again. This is just one picture of climate impacts for our region. We're seeing by the 2050s, 2060s, say, we're expecting well over 45 days of above 30 degrees C temperatures. This is actually, what's interesting is since this map was produced in 2014, in the 7 years since, we have seen increases in very hot days. Well, not every year, but the trend is definitely up. This is the other part of the story. Precipitation is the summer precipitation projected in the order of 280 millimeters in the summer. That's not a big change. That's actually, depending on where you are, a little up, a little down, it doesn't change that much. But the story is a little more nuanced than that. All the models agree that we're going to have much hotter temperatures on the prairies in this region. Most models say we'll get more rain, but some say less. But what we know for sure is that the heat dominates. We're going to have thirstier crops, soils, and atmosphere. That's for sure. Precipitation, an implication of that is precipitation will generate less runoff on average. Moisture will disappear into cracks in the ground and back to the atmosphere. And I think all of us have anecdotes of that happening already. Heavy rainfall, where's the runoff? Well, it's in the ground. This is some analysis that we've worked up here to sort of represent the severity of future drought compared to historical drought. So this is an index called the Standardized Precipitation and Evaporation Index. It's used by, all kinds of meteorological agencies, agricultural forecasting agencies, standard metric that combines precipitation and evaporation. So here you see a historical period. You see that for this historical period up to 1980s, the 50s and early 60s looked dry. The late 60s, 70s looked wet. And then it's sort of a relative thing. As you go further out, you can see now the drought of the 80s appears. You can see the relative drought of the 50s compared to wet episodes in the 70s and 90s. We go further out to the present, and you see that more recent droughts put the droughts of the 80s and 50s into perspective, not as bad. If we had the 30s here, those would look like pretty bad droughts, red. We go further out. Now we're combining the climate information, and the further we go out, the more red we see on the right, which means projected more severe drought episodes, and it relatively diminishes the severity of historical droughts. So here we're out to 2040, and you see the trend line there. The climate projections, when you use a family of these global climate models, they agree on this point. Severity of droughts in the future will get worse. And we're further yet. You can see the trend line, more red on the graph. And as you go out, now we're out to the 2090s, and you see what were drought episodes of the past in the 50s and 80s are starting to not be relatively that severe compared to what we should expect in the future. Now, what's interesting is that there's still, even on the far right, there's still blue. That means there will still be periods of heavy precipitation and even several years of relative wet. And it's an imperative to do better when we do have precipitation. We'll reinforce that point momentarily. So we've worked up a little, just a few slides here. The full story will be presented in the new year at the Red River Basin Conference. I've just picked a few slides here to kind of whet our appetites for that model. So we built a hydrologic model of the Red River Basin to model the joint effects of temperature and precipitation. And without long story short, we think it's a major contribution to hydrologic work in the basin. We use the standard U.S. Army Corps of Engineers hydrologic model called HEC-HMS, and we got very good performance. And by using new data products available through the Global Water Futures Program, we were able to make this model seamless at the 49th parallel. We think it's the first time it's been done. There's no line at the 49th parallel. We're using seamless meteorological and soil and climate data as well. Just no seam at the 49th parallel. So long story short, the projected precipitation for the Red River Basin, most models show an increase. Not all, but most. That's the difference between those gray lines and the red line in the precipitation graph. What the models absolutely agree on is that we're going to get warmer. All the models show this warming increase. Now, when you plug that into the hydrologic model, there's a few things to point out. The spring melts are earlier and smaller, so that those historic spring floods, they're less likely. They'll happen sooner. The freshet period, the snowpack is lower, snow melts earlier, and there's a lower overall spring flood peak. Most models show lower runoff on an annual basis. But we still have this risk of flash flooding, like summer, very high precip, very high runoff events. Those are still possible. In fact, more likely in the future. We see significant seasonality changes, and I'll get more into this if you come out for the presentation in January. But basically, we see a shift: more water in winter and fall, and less in spring and summer. So if these are the impacts, what are our adaptation priorities? And I actually kind of I feel like I want to pause here and get some feedback from the audience. Maybe if you want to type into the chat, because I'm going to cut to the chase what we think the absolutely key adaptation priority is for this region. But and maybe what we'll do is we'll save that for the Q&A and the discussion period if you think that there are other highest level adaptation priorities. So I'm gonna sort of tip my hand here a little bit, and I'm gonna say it's multifunctional storage, what's increasingly termed natural infrastructure. So if you were to twist my arm and say you're allowed one adaptation priority, one, Hank, one, this would be it. And so just what is natural infrastructure? And this is an interesting paragraph as well. I really like it. There's many definitions out there. This is the one that I like the best of the ones I've seen. And it's interestingly, it's the one that that was endorsed by the Canadian Council of Ministers in the Environment. And the paragraph reads this: existing, restored, or enhanced combinations of vegetation and associated biology, land and water, and naturally occurring ecological processes that generate infrastructure outcomes. So it's a key idea. We're letting nature do the heavy lifting here, helping it along, but we're using photosynthesis and infiltration and all those great ecological processes to give us a boost here. So we're generating infrastructure outcomes such as preventing and mitigating floods, erosion, and landslides, mitigating effects of extreme heat, and purifying groundwater can be existing natural features or human-made and constructed. It's a key idea. The key point I want to emphasize: natural infrastructure stacks multiple benefits, and it typically has a high return on investment. And just a shout out to Infrastructure Canada, they're allowing you to build those co-benefits, those environmental co-benefits from your infrastructure project into your investment case. Infrastructure Canada requires you to show a benefit cost ratio higher than 2. If you stack up those environmental co-benefits, you'll easily get to 2. We're getting 4s, 5s. We've got an 8 recently on a natural infrastructure project benefit cost ratio. Key point here is, if you have natural infrastructure, keep it. If you need it, build it. And just, this is a document that I have referred to regularly, actually, and it's from 2018, Best Practices and Resources on Climate Resilient Natural Infrastructure. It's made by, produced by a consultancy called ICF for the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. Okay, so what are we really talking about here? We're talking about a flood risk and a drought risk, different times of the years. Typically, we have a spring flood risk, and typically we have a midsummer drought risk. And the point here is that the loss of natural infrastructure increases both flood and drought risk. However, investments in natural infrastructure, unsurprisingly, reduces both risks. So just a few examples of what this looks like. It can be very small. These are small retention projects done typically by watershed districts in Manitoba, and just a few examples of they being constructed. Some innovation around gates, and where we've got a research project on automatic control of culvert gates with sensors, sort of an IoT technology. Is small scale stuff, routinely installed with equipment that's available anywhere in rural Manitoba, for example. Getting a little bigger scale, I like this one a lot. Many of you have heard me talk about it. The Pelly's Lake project got a big shout out at the Watershed Districts Conference last week. Award given to the originator of the concept, Roy Wood from the Red Boyne Watershed District, got a great shout out for his involvement in promoting this project. I love it. I think it's an exceptionally good project. It stacks up flood control and in this case also water quality benefits, assists with infiltration, assists with drought protection, environmental flows mid-season. I love this project. I've seen it up close and personal, worked on it. I think it's great. Pelly's Lake. This is another project we worked on recently. This is the idea of designing basically a kind of a bioretention treatment wetland complement to existing municipal lagoons, where we're not just discharging municipal lagoon water, we're actually using it as an irrigation source, as a source of nutrients. We're using the water and the nutrients. We're turning what is a waste product into a valuable product. I like this one a lot as well. And then this is just a recent example of harvesting some co-benefits, nutrients, biomass, energy, carbon from a natural infrastructure project, Grants Lake, Manitoba, near the city of Winnipeg. This is another excellent example of a natural infrastructure project in the Red River Basin. This one's in American Minnesota. I've toured it as well. I wish I'd been involved in the design of it. I think it's brilliant. 3 square miles impounded for flood and drought protection. They baked in to this concept as well the idea of opportunistic cropping, opportunistic biomass removal, just what happens when engineers and biologists get together creatively and with the community and collaborate. It's an excellent project, and I'm glad it exists in our basin. This is another larger scale example of natural infrastructure. Some might argue with me that this is more like conventional civil engineering. I would argue that we are creating a new habitat. We are building a fishery effectively. We are providing major environmental flow drought protection to the reach of the Boyne River between Treehorn and Stephenfield Reservoir. So I would argue it is natural infrastructure. Okay, so why is LiDAR important? Simple answer, LiDAR accelerates natural infrastructure systems design from field to basin scale. I would go further if we sort of internalize the value of this data, this geospatial data. It helps us build a culture of water harvesting, which is, I regard, the absolutely key climate adaptation priority for this region. So what is LiDAR? Well, it's this airborne acquisition of high resolution topographic information, and it's based on the principle that you shoot a laser at the ground, and based on the time of the response signal, you can determine the distance between the sensor and the ground, and therefore you know, with some other corrections, within centimeters, the elevation of that point on the ground. And it's tremendous data, tremendous technology, really. And we're celebrating, in some sense, the completion of 100% LiDAR coverage for the Canadian portion of the Red River Basin. So it took a while. The Americans showed us a few things, and particularly the value of LiDAR, but we're there. And we've got I believe the last 5-meter LiDAR has now been superseded. So I believe we have, there might be a few 5-meter remnants, but I believe we have almost 100%, I'm going to say 95% plus 1-meter LiDAR for the Canadian portion of the Red River Basin, which is a tremendous data resource. So using LiDAR for multiple purposes, from field scale to basin scale, and I'll just give you an example here, reducing erosion. So this is erosion is where you lose your soil. It just runs off because you've got, I mean, there's wind erosion too, but it represents a loss of money. It represents a loss of money, loss of productivity, damages downstream ecosystems, clogs culverts, whatever. You got intense rainfall as is expected with climate change, and you don't want to lose your soils when it does rain. So you can use LiDAR to map where you're exposed, where your high risks of erosion are, and further, you can design your fields to intercept water and soil and nutrients that would otherwise run off your field in a heavy rainfall event. This is just an example of cutting contours, cutting little furrows. It's a nice little piece of equipment, low horsepower tractor, generally quite feasible, but not if you don't know where to drive that tractor. And LiDAR makes this workflow very simple, designing contours. And I just want to give a shout out to Living Labs. We did a lot of this analysis and design work with the Ag Canada Living Labs program. And I really encourage Living Labs to mainstream this agricultural beneficial management practice when Living Labs is renewed, because the LiDAR supports an accelerated workflow for designing this contour-based farming approach, which is highly compatible with new ideas around regenerative agriculture. So a little shout out to that possibility and to Living Labs. So it's just another example of practical applications of LiDAR. Here we're going to do some culvert sizing with LiDAR and just how that works. So this is a sort of an arbitrary, semi-arbitrary gated culvert in rural Manitoba. it's been a pinch point for some of the. It's been a matter of concern, reasons I won't get into. What we do need to know is what the design flow is at this location. And what LiDAR allowed us to do is recognize that, in fact, the catchment area for this particular culvert changes with the degree of precipitation. And a 1 in 20 year design flow is about 2.35 CMS, 83 CFS. A 1 in 50 design flow is we're adding about 40%, 30% of catchment area, but we've gone up actually about 2.5 times in design flow, because LiDAR allowed us to recognize that ponding increased the effective catchment area that particular culvert location would see under a high flow scenario, a 1 in 50 year. This is yet another example of LiDAR for climate adaptation. This one is with respect to the new federal guidelines for flood damage estimation for buildings and infrastructure. So the federal government has published this relatively recent, March of this year, pretty detailed geomatic standard actually for flood damage guidelines, and we've applied that. Basically what it says is that the damage to different classes of infrastructure, buildings for example, varies with the amount of flooding, and that's not surprising. And there's some good data from the insurance industry, which the federal government has collated, and they've produced generalized damage functions now. The LiDAR allows us an accurate determination of the depth of flooding of various buildings and infrastructure in your municipality, in your town, in your jurisdiction. And this is just an example of some overland flood modeling we've done with every tax parcel, building, and road network feature exposed. Allows us to estimate, to come up with a perfect estimate of damage. Definitely not perfect, but a consistent, conformant with federal guidelines estimate. It's just an example of this applied this is downtown Winnipeg actually, where we've got a damage function for every building, every tax parcel. This is what it looks like for a generalized rural case, where we've got a damage estimate of flooding for this scenario for this section, and we've got this generalized over rural Manitoba, not a lot of it anyway. This is an example of LiDAR for natural infrastructure site identification at the watershed scale. What LiDAR allows us to do is construct 3D models of retention storage sites. And I just jumped ahead here. So I'll just give you a little bit of detail here. This is a river in southern Manitoba. We've got some locations, priority locations, where we want to examine the efficiency of retaining water at these points in the valley. So we extrude a 3D model of an earthen dam, and we determine for different potential locations the minimum amount of earthwork, for maximum storage. So we have a measure of relative efficiency of these different reservoir locations. I'm jumping around here. I'm a little bit, the keys are going a little crazy on me. Anyway, it gives you a sense of what you can use LiDAR for. This is since we're talking North Basin and we're close to Lake Winnipeg, I thought I'd give you a little sneak preview of a new tool we're releasing, and this is how you integrate LiDAR with opportunities for phosphorus capture. We're calling it PhosFinder, and it's a Canadian alternative to PTM app, which Minnesota Bureau of Soil and Water Resources developed, and it's really was inspirational for us. It has difficulty with the high resolution 1 meter LiDAR, so we built a Canadian model, very much duplicating the functionality of PTM app. And it allows you, this is again using LiDAR for a climate adaptation opportunity, which is storing water and harvesting nutrients. So at this particular location, we've got an estimate of 43 kilograms of phosphorus intercepted that is potentially interceptable at that point. Oh yeah, sorry, that animation didn't quite work, but you kind of get the idea. If you built a treatment wetland at that point, and in this case, you're combining it with lagoon effluent, but we're capturing some overland flow, and then we allow the sun and we allow the species that love high nutrient content to do the heavy lifting. That's why it's natural infrastructure, and improve water quality. And here we're harvesting it. We're harvesting those nutrients out for their phosphorus, carbon, and energy content. Okay, on to the North Chapter case study. How we're found this is a really interesting use of LiDAR, we think. So we're going to go back up here. This was the recent LiDAR acquired, one of the last pieces, Netley Grasmere. So now the East Interlake Watershed District and the municipalities up in that area have pretty much 100% 1 meter continuous LiDAR. I'm also going to point out this little feature here, the Interlake Shoal Lakes. It's kind of they flood occasionally. And inundate a lot of pasture land nearby. What we did was we did a LiDAR processing exercise we were initially going to do the Netley Grasmere Creek watershed and Willow Creek together, and then our partner said, no, let's do the Shoal Lakes too. I'm just going to point out, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but there's these features, these glacial striations. As the glacier retreated to the northwest, it left these features, these topographic features, and we're going to examine those in a little more detail, which I think you can only really do with LiDAR. So all of those dots represent a culvert location. So what we did was we had thousands of these, and we did a hydro conditioning exercise. It's, we have some efficient workflows for doing that, so it wasn't too bad. But so the LiDAR, this high resolution digital elevation model, is corrected for the way the water actually flows, not what the airborne sensor sees, because it can't see the culvert pipes. So we made all those corrections because our partner had an excellent culvert inventory. We used high performance computing to do this job because 8 billion pixels at 1 meter resolution, these are very large computational challenges. And you get results, and it's almost, you can't really interpret it at the level of detail that we can generate. It's actually quite hard to interpret. So we're going to dive in a little closer and just focus on the Shoal Lake feature. And we're pretty sure, following one of these glacial striation features, that there is a flow path connecting the Shoal Lakes to the Grasmere. And that's the official hydrography from the official watershed boundary. But yeah, we forced this case with 100 millimeters of precipitation, and you see how those striations, those glacial artifacts, basically create a hydrographic connection. And we're pretty confident that the shoal system is connected to the Grasmere system. And it's a kind of analysis that you could never ever do if you didn't have a data source like LiDAR. So the LiDAR essentially reveals new water resources management possibilities. And this is just the second map is just intended to sort of reveal the possibilities. If you could bring the shoal lakes, if you could basically activate them as natural infrastructure features and use them for flood and drought protection, that little triangles represent, candidate downstream storage locations, semi-arbitrary, although we're doing some analysis on this point too. What you do is you're harvesting water, and that helps with things like groundwater recharge throughout municipalities in this region. If you're dependent on groundwater, well, how are you going to drive recharge? Well, maybe really locally, or maybe in collaboration with your neighbors to identify areas to store and infiltrate. This is the sort of new opportunities for collaborative management are revealed when you can get inside this data and think about what it means. And I think this is an interesting example thereof. So So we're still going to have wet periods. There's still going to be occasionally the shoal lakes are going to want to flood. But what is the sort of the minimal amount of management that we could place on those things to activate them for flood protection, for drought protection? They're on relatively high ground, although it's quite a flat area. How do we bring that supply, that new supply, to benefit the downstream municipalities? These are the modern water resources management opportunities that lie before us. So I guess the LiDAR gives us a tool. This is the sort of the key point here for designing natural infrastructure networks efficiently, as they are so much needed for climate adaptation. And it's our contention here, and it's certainly been the experience of our partners and clients, that if you can plan and design natural infrastructure networks, you will attract investors to those projects, because smart money knows this is necessary. I'm just going to kind of circle us right back to the beginning. We got about 15 minutes left in this slot, and just say that this was the key point that the federal government made in this sort of overview of climate impacts on prairie provinces, is that this collaborative water management idea is so important. And I am so grateful that the Red River Basin Commission exists and can bring people together to have these conversations. And I greatly admire Steve's tenacity in getting this work, pulling this work out of us. I'm honored to be able to support the work of the commission, and grateful that the commission can pull together so many different stakeholders, because that's what's required here. That's all I have. There's some contact information. I guess if you don't know me, if you haven't met me, I should have said I'm the CEO and senior engineer here at Strategic Systems Engineering. I've been a professional engineer and water resources engineer for over 25 years, and I've got a wonderful team of young, talented people, and we're delighted to bring this expertise to the work of the commission. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I think there is enough time for Q&A.
Yeah, before we start that, Hank, I just want to talk about a few things. So when you give consideration to the LiDAR collected out of the northern region, it gives representation so that every community has the opportunity to adjust themselves. As Hank talked about, whether it's, you want to talk about adaptation or resilience, no matter what you call it, there's a need for you to recognize what your community could be facing for the future. Whether that would be drought, which could create a reduction of water tables, which could affect your, water, your potable water for your communities, or it could affect your farmers and needing, creating a desire for need for crop irrigation, or, just the fact that, the dryness is going to create more fires. And how do you deal with these sort of things as a community? If you're in a heavily treed area, or you have areas that are heavily treed, which a lot of areas along the lakes are that way, then how do you address this? Some communities, sometimes when you're giving consideration to fires, you got to make sure your community can get out, right? That's really important. So LiDAR has brought many things to the table. It has given us the opportunity to talk about these concerns that are coming forward from climate change. And even though this presentation is very high level, you have a need to sit down as a council to talk about how this can affect your community, and perhaps looking and giving considerations to these needs, and how do you take these needs and adopt them into your emergency plan. I mean, if you were sitting in British Columbia and you're in the middle of trying to create a cleanup, and you've got all this damaged infrastructure, where not only does it affect your community, but the whole country is expecting things to travel through the highway corridor, the train corridor. How do we get our supplies? I mean, all these things can very much affect us as communities, and having plans in place in order to try to deal with this, in order to try to create adaptation to help your community, is really a necessity. So again, even though we're high scale on this presentation and this report that will come forward to the federal government, we really want to say to you that you as a community should really be communicating with one another, talking not only to yourselves, to your neighbors, because a lot of these issues can be addressed not only collectively as one community, but as many communities coming together and creating partnerships. And as Hank's presentation showed, there is going to be a larger need because it's going to be more frequent. If we get to a period where we see 45 hot, dry days in the summertime, what is this going to do to all of us? How is it going to affect us? How is it going to affect our farm community, which affects the food, and so on and so forth? So we encourage you, now that the LiDAR has been collected and that the data is available, for you to look at engaging not only yourselves, but maybe organizations like Strategic in order to help you build a more detailed climate adaptation plans, which will address these issues as we go forward. So with that, I want to say thank you to everybody. We do have an opportunity to, if anybody had any questions, you can post. I don't see anything up there right now, but please, if anybody has any questions, feel free to bring them forward.
Yeah, I can stay on till at least 10 after. So if there's a good 15 minutes of Q&A we can do here if people want.
Right.
You know.
If there's nothing that's coming up on the chat, maybe we can even allow you the opportunity, because our number's only gone down by a few, is you can turn on your mic and you can, ask questions, right? I want to say it's great to see some of I'm looking across the names right now and I see a number of familiar faces and people that's online. I see Chris there from Stonewall, or from Rockwood. So nice to see you, Chris. But yeah, if you guys have any questions that you want to bring forward, please feel free to turn your mic on, ask a question. Some of the things I just want to hit on, just one more thing before we let everybody go. Even though we are talking about climate adaptation, I just want you all to remember that we are very much focused, as Hank said earlier, in giving consideration to water retention for multiple purposes. And water retention can offer up many things. It offers up the ability for flood mitigation. It offers up the ability for water retention for potable water, for irrigation for fields, for agriculture, for livestock. It also offers up an opportunity to reduce phosphorus loading into our system. As many of you know, that we have lost at least 70 to 75% of our wetlands throughout the prairies, and creating these retention sites will help us build on that again. If we're able to reduce our phosphates, then we're able to create a more healthier and like Winnipeg, which will enhance our fish populations. It will bring the wildlife, the fauna, and the flora back. It's no different than us working on the Netley Marsh Renewal Pilot Project. So
exactly.
Climate resilience, climate adaptation can be a multi-beneficial project. And I really want to encourage you all, we do at the River Basin, and I'm sure Hank does too, to sit back, give consideration to working collectively together as a council, creating climate adaptation plans, which again, you can build scenarios of worst case and give consideration to that within your emergency plans. Nobody wants a 1 in 500 year flood. If you look at BC, Hank, what was the name they utilized for the rainfall? A atmospheric river?
Atmospheric river. Yeah, that's what hit BC. These are rivers in the sky, as they say, and they can hit here too. They're tend to be a little more targeted at coastal areas, but they can't come inland. A big one can't come inland. I'm gonna actually go off the script here slightly. I see that Bryce Gallant from Climate West is signed on as Bryce Gallant Climate West, and I met Bryce in Brandon last week, and I'm just curious, Bryce, if you could tell us a little bit about Climate West and how we can work together.
Yeah, so Climate West is a newer nonprofit based here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, that's helping build the prairie's resilience to the changing climate. And basically, our mandate is very much to help both municipalities, Indigenous communities, a variety of sectors in their adaptation plans. And a big part of what we do is, if you need help getting started with your adaptation planning, you can go to our website in the help desk and we can kind of point you in the right direction of the kind of the data you need, like LiDAR, or if you need help building capacity, what tools are available for you. We can help guide you to those resources.
Bryce, maybe you can just say a few words on your view of how important it is for municipalities to give this serious consideration.
It's extremely crucial. We're actually in the new year going to be putting out a blog post that looks at the fact that there's a variety of funding available, and we're seeing a bit of a gap in the prairie region in particular, accessing some of that funding to adapt, and that leaves you very vulnerable to, you know, flooding and drought. And we want to make sure that communities are prepared for, you know, more severity and the increase in variability.
I want to say to all those that are continuing to listen on, I think there is a question up there because I see one mark, but I mean, we always think it's never going to happen to us, but you know, it does. When I sat in council in 2006 and we dealt with the Gull Lake tornado, the many times that we dealt with flooding, the 97 flood, and the many years thereafter, we deal with ice-induced flooding. A lot of the municipalities that are around the lake have to be dealing with, you know, issues of fast runoff because, you know, if you're sitting alongside the river source, the water's coming through you. So how are you dealing with that? And if we ever had to deal with something like an atmospheric river, as you call it, and how do we adjust to that? And, you know, I know that we can't adjust to everything. If we give consideration to the size of the floodway that's built here and the size of the diversion that they're building down in Fargo, it's really difficult to do. But I think the thing is, if you at least take the time to talk about it and to give it consideration and try to insert it somehow within your plans to understand, you know, what you need. And I think an example is, you know, like, you know, as we're always so used in this area to spring melt flooding. And let's give consideration to the dike that's around the town of Morris, right? I know they're not in, they'll be in the session later today. But then if you're prepared for a 1 in 100 year, 1 in 200 year, then what do you need to do to be prepared for the 1 in 500 year? Do you have to build your dike another 6, 7, 8 feet? And what, you know, if that's the case, how do you do it? And where do you get resources? And those are the sort of things that we think that need to be, the whole string, the whole line needs to be connected here. And as municipalities, we have a responsibility to do that. And as Bryce said, there's money available for that. And, you know, organizations like Hank here, Strategic, can help you get to the point you need to get to. So,
you know, it's our pleasure to support the commission and hopefully Climate West and I actually think that yeah, there's a kind of a collaboration potential between the commission and Climate West, but that's just a suggestion. So I'm curious if I can provoke a few more, if people want to go for a couple more minutes. I know some people on the call as well, and I'll only pick on old friends.
There is a question.
Oh, we do? Okay.
Okay, I'll read it. I am a counselor from Victoria Beach. Our recreational community is located in a densely forested area with only one way in and out of the area. The risk of wildfires is significant. Given the likelihood of higher summertime temperatures, the risk increases. Our population loves our trees. Any suggestions?
Yeah, you go first, Steve.
Well, I think you really got to sit down and look at the area. You need to work with your public works folks. You need to come up with a pretty solid plan. I know Victoria Beach very well. You know, I've been up into the community many, many times. I know there's a couple of side roads that run along the beach to get out. You need to have within your emergency response an exiting plan, and it's those types of plans that you need to be sharing with your community. I love our trees too, but there are some times where, you know, I used to live in Shiloh for a number of years when I was a young lad, and they would basically cut breaks within the area in order to reduce the pressures of possible forest fires. And sometimes those are the things that you need to give consideration to. But having a stronger plan is certainly a necessity. And if you don't have any other options, I really want to encourage you to get one, because Nobody wants to lose some trees, but nobody wants their whole community to burn down either. Hank?
That's better than I could do. You've got the experience in local government. I can't top that. I mean, yeah, this is Steve's made the point about emergency preparedness, and LiDAR can help with certain bits of an emergency plan. There's other other things like just that you'll have to be conscious of. That don't pertain specifically to LiDAR for climate adaptation, including how do people, if in an extreme heat wave, what do you actually do with people that don't have access to air conditioning? It's just it doesn't have anything to do with LiDAR, but it is an adaptation priority. And so that's just an aside. Well, I was just gonna. I mean, I've known Tony Shumagalski a long time, and he's out there, and I know he knows the agroecological scene very, very well. And I'm just curious if Tony would offer a few comments on the agricultural perspective on this presentation.
Thanks, Hank, and really enjoyed your presentation, and good talking to you again, Steve.
Yeah, good to see you, Tony.
Yeah, glad you're doing this work. It's really important, and yeah, it's definitely important for agriculture as well. I mean, the extremes of moisture have hit the sector quite hard over the last decade from one side of the pendulum to the other. So right now we're on the drought cycle. So yeah, I see these types of projects are really important, not just for communities, but as you mentioned before, Hank, like for agriculture as well. And the small projects are good because they do add up if you do enough of them. And yeah, I think these types of projects will add resilience to the agricultural system, not just for potential irrigation, but just the flood control and soil management. And I think this might tie into some systems looking at tile drainage. If tile drainage is done really smartly with controls, it could be quite an amazing tool if we do it right. So I found those contours very interesting. Hank, I didn't. I guess I haven't really been up to speed on what they're doing at the Living Labs.
Well, it's actually it's a USDA design standard that we think should be experimented with in Canada as we start to get the climate of the sort of the mid. It's an agricultural BMP that came out of the sort of the central Great Plains for drought protection, and it's been widely adopted, and we think we should start experimenting with it in Canada. It's so important, I think, because the rains are going to come heavy. When they come, they're going to come heavy, and so it's one of those protection mechanisms. You still can do all kinds of, and as long as they're not too narrow, you can still get equipment in and out. It's just that you want to lay them out sensibly, you want to lay them out efficiently. And LiDAR is a great asset for doing so. We think that you can integrate with other benefits, carbon sequestration and pollinator habitat. They all fit together rather nicely. And it's just LiDAR is a great asset for that style of resilient agriculture. And wish us luck. We hope to see it in the next version of Living Labs.
Troy, I just want to ask you a question before you cut out here. Just maybe give me your opinion as you work within the ag sector. The idea of getting the water off the land as fast as you can, certainly has changed, or is starting to change. And as we've gone through the last couple of years and we're seeing this drought cycle, I think farmers are starting to really realize that maybe they need to start taking a different look. And when you talked about tile drainage, you now see some of the farm guys putting reservoirs or capturing retention areas within their tile drainage. The expectation in my mind would be that, even though each farmer is going to have to deal with this, collectively it will be important for the municipalities to play a role in the future in order to give consideration to any type of main drains or any type of water drains that are flowing where, the possibility of creating retention and capturing areas may be essential as we move forward in the future.
Absolutely.
Totally agree. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we need to look at all the small wins, and the other key is besides these water retention projects, is to build soil health in general across the whole system. I mean, that's adding resiliency to the whole system as well.
So, you know, definitely the message is it's going to create, or it creates a need of partnership, not only from the individuals or a separate farmer, but also from the municipalities. I think as we're talking about, you know, food is essential. And as our agricultural areas supplies, you know, they supplies the beef, they supply the wheat and everything else, it feeds our country. And we're going to have to work together in order to take care of this as we go forward, especially looking at.
There's a gentleman on the call with the name of David Van Vliet, who I believe I've met, and I believe is from the University of Manitoba. And if I'm not mistaken, is a planning professor, but I could have the wrong David Van Vliet. But David, if it is you, would you kind of care to provide an academic perspective on this?
Yeah, well, I agree, Hank. It was really good presentation. Access to the LiDAR data has to be, readily accessible. It seemed to me the missing, you made one reference to watershed districts, and that seems to be the missing element here in terms of potential for integration in the northern region in terms of what their mandate is. And I made a comment about certainly their role in terms of living lab function could be enhanced greatly, because there needs to be more widespread implementation of project work. And I'm not really sure. I've had a confusing time following the transition from the conservation districts ending over to the responsibilities of the watershed districts. And I'm hoping that their capacity is going to be increased considerably by the province, but it's certainly where the Red River Basin Commission and other organizations like Climate West could be pushing to try to get that and the Climate Center to get some on the ground work being coordinated.
I totally agree, David.
Yeah, I will just say that I totally agree, David.
Long story short, the watershed districts are essentially the conservation districts. There were some minor border modifications and went from 16 conservation districts to 14 watershed districts, I believe. And they are doing a great job, and many of them are our project partners. And they are making that transition. And I would say there are still capacity gaps. Some of them use LiDAR, some of them don't. The direction is correct. The level of capacity to do all of the work that's necessary, well, that's always a work in progress. But I think the policy direction is correct, and they have access to things like the Conservation Trust for project funding, which is an improvement. Is it enough? It's never enough. But the direction and the momentum is as good as I've seen since I've been back in the province, and it's for 20 years. There's more momentum on integrated watershed planning than in the previous 20 years, I would say.
I just want to say that we're very pleased to have been able to partner with the provincial government here, the province of Manitoba, funding through ourselves and working with our watersheds are what brought the LiDAR data to the Red River Basin. We are the only basin in Manitoba that has complete coverage. And because of the commitment and the partnership, we are able to refly important areas such as the Red River Corridor. With this updated LiDAR data, we're going to be able to do many things with it. And creating the climate adaptation plans is a big part of it. So what I would like to say is here's the data, here's the tools. As municipalities, you have an understanding of what you need to do and how you need to get there. But if you're needing more information, you can reach out to ourselves here at the Red River Basin Commission. You could reach out to Hank at Strategic. There's a lot of opportunities that are coming forward. There's funding available for you to do more. And as you look at many of the major infrastructure projects that you're about to work on within your communities over the next number of years, it's a requirement for you to give consideration to how you built this resiliency into those projects. The governments do not want to be building infrastructure where they could be prone to flooding or whatever, some type of climate crisis there becomes. So as Hank said, some of the scoring within that now seems to be getting really high, up to 8, and I think that's remarkable. And that if you have an opportunity as a municipality or for a First Nations community, you need to give it consideration, because I think as we go forward, you'll see more and more connection between the two in your funding. So please be aware of that. We want you to plan. We want you to be all safe. And remember that the reality of climate change is before us. We're going to have no choice to address it. You have an option. You can be either proactive or you're reactive. And if you're reactive, it hurts your community and it costs you a hell of a lot more money. Hank, anything on ending?
Good projects will attract investors. They're desirable in their own right, and it makes your municipality, your town, more desirable for inbound investment. You can tell people, look, we know what we're doing, we're protected, spend your money here, invest here, build that plant here.
Definitely. So on behalf of the Red River Basin Commission, on behalf of Hank and Strategic, we want to thank you all for coming out and joining us today. The final plans will be ready and available. You can go online to the Red River Basin. Just look us up. Some of you may already have our QR code, but Rebecca will be sending everything out via email, and you'll be able to follow those types of links, and we can build upon that. Thank you, everybody. Very grateful. We'll end the session.
Very good. Thank you.